The flash of a camera's bulb was blinding, but not as blinding as the diamond necklace gracing the wrong woman's throat. It was the Starlight Collier from Cartier. A piece whispered about in hushed, envious tones across the city's elite, a piece Richard Vance had sworn was a surprise for his and Catherine's 5th anniversary. But here it was nestled against the porcelain skin of Tiffany Sterling, his impossibly young, impossibly blonde assistant. They stood on the steps of the Grand Oak Ballroom, a portrait of power and infidelity for the whole world to see. Little did Richard know, the real picture of the evening hadn't even been taken yet. Because just beyond the glare of the paparazzi, another car, a silent obsidian Rolls-Royce, was pulling up to the curb. The silence in the sprawling Upper East Side penthouse was a living entity. It breathed in the spaces between the minimalist Italian furniture and coiled around the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Central Park. For Catherine Vance, the silence had become a constant companion, a more faithful partner than her own husband. At 5 months pregnant, she felt like a ghost haunting the museum-like perfection of her own home. Her hand rested protectively on the gentle curve of her belly, a silent promise to the new life she carried. A life she had once naively believed would be the glue to mend the cracks in her marriage. Richard Vance, a man whose ambition was as sharp and cutting as his tailored Armani suits, had become a collection of echoes. The echo of his laughter from a time when it was meant for her, the echo of his footsteps as he left before sunrise, the echo of his voice on the phone, clipped and dismissive. "It's for the company, darling. You understand?" She always said she did. The evening of the annual Children's Health Foundation Gala had loomed on her calendar for months. It was the event of the season, a glittering affair, where New York's old money and new ambition collided in a symphony of champagne flutes and feigned camaraderie. It was also traditionally their night. Richard was a major benefactor, his company, Vance Holdings, a primary sponsor. Their attendance was not just expected, it was a performance. This year, however, the performance had been cancelled. 2 days ago, Richard had breezed into their bedroom, smelling of a perfume that wasn't hers, something sharp and synthetic, like cheap ambition. He had loosened his tie, his back to her, and announced he had to fly to Zurich for an emergency board meeting. A sudden merger, he'd said the words practiced and smooth. "It's unavoidable, Catherine. You know how critical this quarter is." He'd feigned regret, running a hand through his perfectly coiffed hair. "You shouldn't go alone, not in your condition. Just rest. We'll make it up, I promise." The promise was as hollow as the rest of him. Catherine had learned to read the subtle tells, the way his left eye twitched when he lied, the slight tightening of his jaw. She saw them both. She didn't argue. She simply nodded at the dutiful wife and watched him pack a small suitcase with an efficiency that spoke of practice. The lie unraveled with humiliating ease. Her best friend Penelope, a sharp-witted art curator who saw the world in unfiltered color, had sent her the link that afternoon. It was from a gossip blog, Park Avenue Whispers, featuring a candid shot from the day before. Richard, very much in New York and not Zurich, was stepping out of a jeweler's on 5th Avenue. On his arm, clinging to him like expensive ivy, was Tiffany Sterling. Tiffany, his new executive assistant, a woman half Catherine's age, with a predatory smile and a wardrobe funded by a salary that seemed impossibly generous for her role. In the photo, Tiffany was laughing, holding up a black velvet box. The caption was snide and suggestive. "Looks like Vance Holdings is finalizing a very different kind of merger. Is Zurich the new code for the Hamptons?" The air left Catherine's lungs. It wasn't just the lie. It was the brazenness of it. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. He was flaunting it. The gala was tonight. He had lied about Zurich to take her, to debut her. The realization hit Catherine with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't just replacing her, he was erasing her. This gala, their night, was to be Tiffany's coronation. For an hour, Catherine sat on the cold marble floor of her bathroom, the phone lying screen up beside her. The silence of the penthouse pressed in, suffocating her. Tears she had held back for months finally fell hot and silent. This wasn't just about infidelity. It was about utter disrespect. It was about the 5 years she had dedicated to being his partner, hosting his dinners, charming his investors, standing by his side as he built his empire. It was about the child she carried, a child he had claimed to want, now reduced to an inconvenient footnote in his new narrative. Her grief, however, slowly began to curdle, hardening into something else. It was a cold, quiet fury. He expected her to stay home, to be the pregnant, forgotten wife, weeping into a silk pillow. He was counting on her dignity, her breeding, her unwillingness to cause a scene. He had underestimated her. He had forgotten who she was before she became Mrs. Richard Vance. She scrolled through her contacts, her thumb hovering over a name she hadn't dialed in nearly a decade. A name that represented a different life, a different path, a time before the gilded cage had closed around her. Her finger trembled as she pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice, a voice smooth as aged whiskey, and warm with a kindness she hadn't heard in years answered. "Catherine, is everything all right?" She took a shaky breath, the resolve solidifying in her chest. "Sebastian," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "I need a favor, and I need a date to the Children's Health Foundation Gala. Tonight." There was a pause on the other end, not of hesitation, but of calculation. She could almost hear the gears turning in his brilliant mind. "I assume Sebastian Thorne," said, his tone shifting from surprise to a low, protective growl, "that you have a point to make." "I have more than a point," Catherine replied, looking at her reflection in the polished chrome of the faucet. A woman with tear-streaked cheeks, but eyes of burning steel. "I have a declaration to make." The rain began to fall as Catherine spoke, fat, cinematic drops that smeared the perfect view of the city into an impressionistic blur. It was a fitting backdrop for the deconstruction of her life. On the other end of the line, Sebastian Thorne listened without interruption, a skill he had perfected long ago. He didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. He simply absorbed her story, the casual cruelties, the blatant lies, the final public humiliation Richard had planned for her. Sebastian and Catherine had a history etched in the libraries of Columbia University, not the ballrooms of Manhattan. They had been inseparable, two scholarship kids, fueled by late-night coffee and a shared, ravenous ambition. He was a prodigy in computer science, seeing patterns in code that others couldn't fathom. She was a brilliant art history major, with a knack for identifying forgeries, a skill she now wryly acknowledged had failed her in her own marriage. They had dated for 2 years, a relationship of intellectual equals, of shared dreams, whispered in dorm rooms, but their paths had diverged. His tech startup had exploded, catapulting him into a world of venture capital and stratospheric wealth he had never sought but managed with quiet grace. She had met Richard Vance at a university fundraiser, swept away by his charisma and the sheer force of his ambition, which she had mistaken for strength. Sebastian had warned her, not in a jealous rage, but with the calm, analytical concern of a true friend. He sees the world in terms of assets, Kat, he had told her, over a final coffee. Make sure you're never just an asset. She hadn't listened. She had chosen the dazzling certainty of Richard's world over the uncertain, albeit brilliant, future with Sebastian. They had drifted apart, their contact dwindling to polite Christmas cards and the occasional shared headline in the society pages. Now, hearing his voice, steady and present across the chasm of 10 years, felt like finding an anchor in a raging storm. When she finished her story, her voice raw with unshed tears, the silence that followed was different from the one in her apartment. It was a thoughtful, supportive silence. His table is number 1. Front and center, I presume? Sebastian asked, his voice devoid of any "I told you so." Of course, Catherine whispered. He paid $500,000 for the sponsorship. He wants to be seen. He will be, Sebastian said, and for the first time Catherine could hear the ice in his tone. It was the calm, chilling voice of a man who didn't make threats, but rather stated inevitable outcomes. Give me 90 minutes. A car will be waiting for you downstairs. Wear the dress. The dress, Catherine was confused. The emerald one. The one you wore to the Visconti Gallery, opening 6 years ago. You said it was the only thing Richard ever bought you that felt like it was for you, not for his image. Wear it for yourself tonight. A wave of shock washed over her. He remembered. After all this time, he remembered a passing comment about a dress. It was a small detail, but it was everything. It was a testament to a man who listened, who saw her, who remembered the person she was, not just the role she played. After the call, Catherine moved with a newfound purpose. The lethargy that had clung to her for months evaporated, replaced by a crystalline resolve. She went to her closet, a vast walk-in cathedral of designer labels. She pushed past the muted, tasteful gowns Richard preferred, the beiges, the navies, the charcoals, and found it in the very back, encased in a preservation bag. The dress was a masterpiece of deep emerald silk that shimmered like a forest pool at twilight. It was elegant but daring, with a classic cut that would drape beautifully over her baby bump, accentuating it rather than hiding it. It was a dress of life, of vibrancy, not of mourning. As she slipped it on, she felt a piece of her old self click back into place. Next she went to her jewelry box. Inside lay the opulent, heavy pieces Richard had gifted her over the years. Diamonds, sapphires, rubies, all magnificent, all cold. They felt like property markers, brandings of his success. She ignored them all. Instead, she opened a small, worn wooden box tucked away in a drawer. Inside was a pair of delicate, vintage moonstone earrings. They had been a gift from Sebastian for her 21st birthday, bought from a dusty antique shop downtown. They weren't worth a fraction of the other jewels, but they held more value than all of them combined. They glowed with a soft internal light, a quiet defiance against the garish sparkle of Richard's world. Her makeup was minimal but precise, a sweep of eyeliner to accentuate the fire in her eyes, a touch of color on her lips. When she looked in the mirror, the woman staring back was not the one melancholic wife Richard had left behind. This was Catherine, strong, determined, and ready for battle. Punctually 90 minutes after her call, her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Your chariot awaits." She walked through the silent penthouse, her heels clicking a steady rhythm on the polished marble floors. She didn't look back. As she stepped into the elevator, she caught a glimpse of a wedding photo on a console table. She and Richard, smiling, their eyes full of manufactured joy. For the first time, she saw the cracks in the photograph, the subtle forgery in their expressions. She felt a pang, not of loss for the man he was, but of mourning for the woman who had believed his lies for so long. The elevator doors opened onto the pristine lobby. The doorman, accustomed to Richard's fleet of expensive but soulless German cars, did a double-take. Waiting at the curb was not a Mercedes or a BMW, but a vintage custom-built Rolls-Royce Phantom, its black paint gleaming under the city lights like polished obsidian. A driver in a crisp uniform held the door open. As Catherine slid onto the plush leather seat, she felt the last of her fear fall away. This wasn't just about revenge. Revenge was a messy, emotional affair. This was about reclamation. She was reclaiming her story, her dignity, and her future. The car pulled away from the curb smoothly, silently, a vessel carrying her not to a party, but to the first day of her new life. The battle was about to begin, and for the first time in years, she wasn't fighting it alone. The Grand Oak Ballroom was a maelstrom of calculated glamour. Chandeliers dripping with crystals cast a golden glow over a sea of designer gowns and bespoke tuxedos. The air thick with the scent of expensive perfume, and hothouse flowers buzzed with the practiced laughter and hushed negotiations of New York's 1%. It was a stage, and every guest was an actor playing their part. Tonight, Richard Vance had cast himself as the king. He stood near the grand entrance, a magnum of Dom Perignon in one hand, the other possessively placed on the small of Tiffany Sterling's back. She was radiant in a crimson gown, so aggressively tailored it seemed shrink-wrapped to her body. And there against her skin was the starlight collier, its diamonds catching the light with every sycophantic laugh she offered. They were the center of attention, and they reveled in it. Richard was at the apex of his power, a titan of industry, with a beautiful young woman on his arm, a public declaration of his virility and success. He greeted investors and rivals with the same magnanimous condescension, the unspoken message clear: I have everything. I can do anything. Gossip columnist Beatrice Fairfax, a woman whose pen could make or break reputations, watched them with narrowed eyes. It's a bold move, even for Richard, she murmured to her companion. Catherine is 5 months pregnant. To bring his little intern here, it's not just tasteless, it's a declaration of war. The whispers rippled through the room. Where was Catherine? Was she at home, heartbroken? Had she finally been discarded? The narrative was already being written. The tragic aging wife, replaced by a newer model. Richard could feel the speculation, the mixture of awe and disapproval, and it fueled him. He thrived on audacity. It was precisely at that moment, as the orchestra swelled to a crescendo, that the atmosphere at the entrance shifted. The clamor of the paparazzi outside, which had died down, suddenly erupted with renewed frenzy. The flashes were more intense, more frantic. A collective murmur rippled inward from the doors as heads began to turn. The doors swung open, held by 2 uniformed attendants, and there, framed in the grand entryway, stood Catherine Vance. Silence fell over the ballroom. It was not a gradual quieting, but a sudden, sharp intake of breath, as if the air had been stolen from the room. Catherine was breathtaking. The emerald silk of her gown cascaded over her pregnant form, not as a concession, but as a statement of regal femininity. The moonstone earrings cast a gentle ethereal glow against her skin. Her expression was not one of sadness or anger. It was one of serene, unshakable confidence. She was not a woman scorned. She was a queen arriving at her court. But it was the man by her side who turned the collective shock into stunned disbelief. Sebastian Thorne, the enigmatic billionaire, a legend in the tech world, who rarely made public appearances and never at events as frivolous as this. He was a man whose influence operated in the silent, powerful currents of data and finance, far removed from the gaudy theater of New York society. He was dressed in a simple, impeccably tailored black tuxedo, but he wore it with an authority that made every other man in the room, including Richard, look like a boy playing dress-up. His hand was gently placed on Catherine's back, a gesture not of possession, but of unwavering support. They paused for a moment at the entrance, a tableau of quiet power that completely eclipsed the gaudy spectacle Richard and Tiffany had created. Richard's face, which had been flush with triumph, went pale. The champagne flute in his hand trembled slightly. He stared, his mind struggling to process the scene. This was impossible. This was not part of his script. Catherine was supposed to be at home. Who was this man? He knew the face, of course, everyone knew. Sebastian Thorne, but the connection to Catherine was a devastating blank in his understanding of the world. Tiffany, sensing the shift in power, stiffened. Her smile faltered. The starlight collar around her neck suddenly felt like a cheap imitation, a gaudy prop. Every eye in the room was now on the woman she had been brought here to replace, and Catherine was effortlessly, devastatingly winning. As Catherine and Sebastian began to walk into the ballroom, the whispers erupted into a tidal wave. Is that Sebastian Thorne? What is he doing here with her? My God, look at her. She's glowing. Richard looks like he's seen a ghost. Beatrice Fairfax was already typing furiously into her phone. Forget the merger. The real story of the night has arrived. Catherine Vance, not in mourning, but in majesty, on the arm of the one man in this city who could buy and sell her husband 10 times over. The game has just been changed. They didn't head for a corner table. Sebastian guided Catherine with practiced ease directly towards the center of the room on a collision course with table 1. The crowd parted for them as if by royal decree. As they approached, Richard finally broke from his stupor. He put his champagne down with a thud and took a step forward, his face a mask of fury. Catherine, he hissed, his voice low and menacing. What the hell is this? What are you doing here? Catherine didn't flinch. She met his gaze, her calm expression a stark contrast to his barely contained rage. Before she could answer, Sebastian stepped slightly in front of her, a subtle but unmistakable barrier. He looked down at Richard, not with anger, but with something far more unnerving, pity. Good evening, Richard, Sebastian said, his voice quiet, but carrying in the sudden lull. I believe you know your wife. I'm just making sure everyone else remembers who she is, too. He then glanced at Tiffany, his eyes flicking over the starlight collier with clinical disinterest before dismissing her entirely. Lovely evening for a charity event. The message was clear. Catherine was not abandoned. She was protected, and her protector was a man whose power Richard couldn't hope to match. The king had been checked on his own stage in front of his entire court, and as Catherine met the stunned, furious eyes of her husband, she knew this was not an ending. It was the beginning of his. The ballroom, once a unified stage for Richard's triumph, had fractured into 100 hushed conspiracies. The air crackled with the energy of a scandal far more delicious than any affair. An affair was common. This was a coup. Catherine and Sebastian were the new center of gravity, and every satellite in the room was slowly, cautiously being pulled into their orbit. Sebastian led Catherine not to a random table, but to a one occupied by Harold Beaumont, the elderly, deeply respected chairman of the Children's Health Foundation, and his wife. Beaumont, a man of old money, and even older principles, had always been quietly skeptical of Richard Vance's flashy, aggressive style. "Harold, a pleasure to see you, Sebastian," said his voice, warm and genuine. "You remember Catherine Vance, of course?" Harold Beaumont's eyes, usually sharp and discerning, softened as he looked at Catherine. He rose a gesture of respect he rarely afforded anyone, and kissed her hand. "My dear Catherine, you look absolutely radiant. Pregnancy suits you. Please join us." The invitation was a powerful signal. The kingmaker of New York society had chosen his side. As Catherine and Sebastian sat, a waiter, seemingly appearing from nowhere, placed 2 glasses of sparkling water with lime before them. The message was subtle but potent. Their presence was anticipated and catered to. Across the room, Richard watched this scene unfold with a mixture of rage and panic. His table, the supposed seat of power, suddenly felt like a barren island. People who had been clamoring for his attention minutes before were now conspicuously avoiding his gaze, their eyes darting towards Sebastian Thorne's table. Tiffany, no longer the belle of the ball, sat stiffly, her smile frozen, the diamonds around her neck feeling more like a collar. "Who is he to her?" she whispered desperately to Richard. "I have no idea," Richard snarled, his mind racing. He knew Thorne by reputation, a recluse, a genius, a man who moved markets with a single decision. He had tried to get a meeting with Thorne's venture capital firm for months to secure funding for a new tech division at Vance Holdings, a project that was crucial for his company's future. He had been repeatedly and politely stonewalled. And now that same man was sitting with his wife, looking at her with a familiarity and tenderness that made Richard's blood run cold. He couldn't let it stand. He had to reassert control. Excusing himself, he strode across the floor, his path a wake of silence. He stopped at Harold Beaumont's table, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace. "Catherine, we need to talk," he said, his voice tight with forced civility. He ignored Sebastian completely. Catherine looked up at him, her expression placid. "Richard, you're making a scene." "I'm making a scene," he hissed, leaning down. "You show up here on the arm of him after I told you to stay home. This is a deliberate attempt to humiliate me." It was Sebastian who answered, without even looking up from his conversation with Beaumont. "I believe your instructions were based on a business trip to Zurich. Was the flight cancelled?" The pointed question hung in the air, sharp and deadly. Several people at the neighboring tables choked back laughs. Richard's face flushed a deep, mottled red. He was being played with, openly mocked. He grabbed Catherine's arm. "We are leaving. Now." Before his fingers could tighten, Sebastian's hand shot out and gripped Richard's wrist. The movement was lightning fast and fluid. Sebastian didn't apply overt pressure, but his grip was like steel. He still didn't look at Richard, continuing his conversation with Beaumont, but his voice dropped to a near whisper that was meant only for Richard's ears. "Take your hand off your wife, Richard. You will not touch her again. You will return to your table and you will enjoy the rest of your evening. If you cause even the slightest distress to Catherine, I will make one phone call. And by the time the sun rises tomorrow, Vance Holdings will be a footnote in a textbook on failed hostile takeovers. Am I clear? The threat was delivered with such cold, absolute certainty that Richard felt a genuine sliver of fear. This wasn't the blustering of a business rival. It was a promise from a man who had the power to execute it. He snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned. He stared at Sebastian, who finally turned to meet his gaze. Sebastian's eyes were calm, but held the cold, infinite depth of the ocean. In that moment, Richard understood he was no longer the predator in the room. He was the prey. Defeated, he retreated to his table. The walk back feeling like miles. The entire ballroom had witnessed the exchange. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been shattered and remade. He was a king in his own court. For the rest of the evening, Catherine was the undeniable star. People flocked to her table, investors, socialites, board members of other companies, as all eager to pay their respects to see and be seen with her and Sebastian. She handled it all with a grace and poise that Richard had always taken for granted, but which now, in this new context, looked like untapped strength. She spoke intelligently about art with Penelope, who had arrived and joined their table with a triumphant grin. She discussed charity initiatives with Beaumont's wife. She was charming, witty, and completely in command of herself. Richard, meanwhile, was a pariah. His table guests made flimsy excuses and departed early. Tiffany sat in miserable silence, her big night having turned into a public shaming. The starlight collier, meant to be her crowning glory, was now a symbol of her spectacular miscalculation. Late in the evening, during the charity auction, the final blow was struck. The grand prize was a week-long stay at a private villa in Lake Como. Bidding was fierce, quickly reaching $200,000. Richard, in a desperate attempt to reclaim some semblance of his status, raised his paddle. 300,000, he boomed. A hush fell. Just as the auctioneer was about to close, a calm voice called out from Catherine's table. $1 million, Sebastian said, without even bothering to lift his paddle. The room gasped. The auctioneer was dumbfounded. He finally managed to stammer out. Sebastian leaned over to Catherine. I hear Italy is lovely in the spring, he said softly for only her to hear. A good place to rest before the baby arrives. It was the ultimate power play, an act of casual, breathtaking generosity that simultaneously supported the charity and utterly neutered Richard. It wasn't about the money, it was about the ease with which it was spent. Richard had offered a number to bolster his ego. Sebastian had offered a number to give Catherine a gift. As the gala wound down, Richard and Tiffany were among the first to leave, slipping out a side door to avoid the press. But it was too late. The story was already written. When Catherine and Sebastian finally rose to depart, they were met with a wave of respectful nods and admiring glances. As they walked towards the exit, Catherine felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. She hadn't screamed or cried or thrown a drink. She had simply shown up, reclaimed her name, and allowed her husband to immolate himself on the pyre of his own arrogance. Outside, the obsidian Rolls-Royce was waiting. The driver held the door, and as Catherine slid inside, she looked back at the grand ballroom, a place that had been the backdrop for so much of her unhappiness. Tonight, it had been the stage for her liberation. The war was not over, but the most decisive battle had been won, and she had won it without saying a word. The fallout from the gala was not a slow burn. It was a detonation. By 8:00 a.m. the next morning, Beatrice Fairfax's column was the most read article on the internet, complete with high-resolution photos. One photo in particular had gone viral, a split image. On the left, Richard and Tiffany, looking smug and triumphant upon their arrival. On the right, Catherine and Sebastian at their table, a portrait of elegance and power with Richard in the background, his face a mask of impotent fury. The headline was devastating. The Vance Gala. A king dethroned before his coronation. For Richard, the day began with a series of frantic phone calls. The first was from his chief financial officer, a perpetually nervous man named Gerald. The board is calling for an emergency meeting. Richard, Gerald stammered. They're concerned. About the optics. Optics, Richard roared into the phone, pacing his vast, empty office. It was a party, for God's sake. It has nothing to do with the company. It does when you publicly alienate your wife and she finds comfort with Sebastian. Thorne. Gerald squeaked. Thorne's VC firm, Titan Capital, holds a significant minority stake in 3 of our biggest commercial tenants. If he calls in his markers or influences them to break their leases, we're exposed. Terribly exposed. And the funding for the new tech division. Richard, the primary investor we've been courting, is a known partner of Thorne's. They cancelled their meeting this morning. No reason given. The blood drained from Richard's face. He had seen Sebastian as a personal threat, a rival for Catherine's affection. He hadn't considered the professional ramifications. Sebastian Thorne wasn't just a billionaire. He was an ecosystem. And Richard had just thrown a rock into the center of it. His second call was from Tiffany. She was hysterical. They're calling me a home wrecker. My social media is a war zone. She sobbed. Richard, you have to do something. Release a statement. Tell them we're in love. Don't be an idiot, Tiffany. He snapped, his patience gone. There is no we. You were a diversion. Now you're a liability. He hung up on her, the callousness of his own words barely registering. He was in survival mode. Meanwhile, Catherine was in a calm, quiet war room. She was not in her penthouse, which now felt like enemy territory, but in a discreet suite at the Carlisle Hotel arranged by Sebastian. With her was a woman named Eleanor Vance. No relation, one of the most formidable divorce attorneys in New York City. Eleanor, a woman in her 60s with piercing blue eyes and a mind like a steel trap, had been summoned by Sebastian at dawn. Your prenuptial agreement is ironclad, but it has a standard infidelity clause, Eleanor stated, tapping a perfectly manicured finger on the document. Ordinarily, proving it can be messy and prolonged. However, your husband's performance last night has done 90% of our work for us. He didn't just commit adultery. He broadcasted it. We have a dozen society photographers who will testify under oath about his behavior with Miss Sterling. Catherine nodded, sipping her tea. She felt strangely detached, as if watching a film of someone else's life. Sebastian's team is also providing some ancillary information, Eleanor continued, a predatory gleam in her eye. It appears that Vance Holdings has been engaging in some creative accounting regarding its real estate valuations. Specifically, Richard seems to have used company funds to secure the lease on a certain Miss Sterling's very expensive apartment, and has been funneling money into a shell corporation that owns the jet he claimed to be taking to Zurich. This was news to Catherine. It wasn't just infidelity. It was fraud. The man she had married was not just a cheat. He was a common criminal dressed in a $1,000 suit. "What do you want?" Catherine Eleanor asked, her voice softening slightly. "We can go for blood. We can ruin him completely. Or we can use this as leverage for a quiet, swift, and exceedingly generous settlement." Catherine looked out the window at the city below. She thought of her unborn child. She didn't want a life defined by a bitter public war with her ex-husband. She wanted peace. She wanted a clean slate. But she also wanted justice. "I want what my child and I are entitled to," she said, her voice firm. "I want our future secured. I want the penthouse. It will be my child's home. I want a settlement that reflects the assets he has hidden from me, and I want him out of my life, permanently. The terms are not negotiable." Eleanor Vance smiled. "Excellent." The first legal salvo was fired that afternoon. A courier delivered a thick envelope to Richard's office during his emergency board meeting. As he read the first page, detailing the divorce filing, a freeze was simultaneously placed on all his personal and marital assets. He was trapped. The board meeting was a bloodbath, led by a stern, silver-haired director named Peterson. The members grilled Richard about his personal conduct and its direct financial impact on the company. "Your public spectacle has jeopardized a 9-figure funding round and destabilized our relationship with our tenants," Richard Peterson thundered. "Your judgment is compromised. The board is voting on a motion to suspend you as CEO pending a full internal investigation." Richard was reeling. His company, his kingdom, was being ripped from his grasp. He had thought himself untouchable, but in the space of 24 hours, the fortress he had built around himself had begun to crumble into dust. He stumbled out of the boardroom, dazed. His phone rang again. It was a number he didn't recognize. He answered it, desperate for any news that wasn't catastrophic. "Is this Richard Vance?" a slick, unfamiliar voice asked. "Who is this?" "My name is Julian Croft. I'm Tiffany Sterling's attorney. We're filing a lawsuit for wrongful termination and emotional distress." Richard laughed, a harsh, broken sound. It was absurd. It was a circus. He hung up the phone and stared out his office window. The city looked the same, but his place in it had irrevocably changed. He had flown too close to the sun, and the fall was happening faster than he could have ever imagined. He had lost his wife, his company, his mistress, and his reputation all in a single day. And he knew, with a sickening certainty, that this was only the beginning. The architect of it all was a quiet, unassuming man who had remembered the color of a dress from 6 years ago. A week later, the storm had not passed. It had merely entered a new, more dangerous phase. Richard, suspended from his own company and legally barred from accessing the majority of his wealth, felt like a man suffocating in a vacuum. The press was relentless, camped outside his office building, and the penthouse he could no longer comfortably inhabit. He was a prisoner of his own creation. Desperate, he did the only thing he could think of. He demanded a face-to-face meeting with Catherine. He expected to meet her in a lawyer's office, a sterile, adversarial environment. Instead, she agreed to see him at the penthouse. It was a strategic move designed to unnerve him, to remind him of the life he was losing. When he arrived, the silence was different. It was no longer the oppressive, lonely silence he had left behind. It was a calm, occupied silence. The scent of fresh freesias, Catherine's favorite, hung in the air, replacing the stale scent of his cigars. Penelope was there, sitting quietly in an armchair, a silent sentinel. And in the corner of the room, standing by the window and looking out at the park, was Sebastian Thorne. Richard's temper flared. "I wanted to see my wife, alone." "I'm not your wife anymore, Richard." Not in any way that matters. Catherine said, her voice calm and even. She was sitting on the sofa, a file folder resting on the cushion beside her. She looked healthier than he had seen her in months, the stress replaced by a quiet resolve. Penelope is my friend. Sebastian is my advisor. They stay. This was her territory now. He was the intruder. Defeated, he sank into the chair opposite her. He decided to try the one tactic he had always mastered: manipulation. He would play the victim. "Cat, look at what you're doing," he began, his voice laced with manufactured pain. "This whole thing, it's a nightmare. My company, my reputation, it's all falling apart. Because of one misunderstanding. A misunderstanding." Catherine's laugh was soft, but it cut him to the bone. "You taking your mistress to a gala where I was meant to be wearing a necklace you told me was for me, while lying that you were on another continent. That's not a misunderstanding, Richard. That's a business plan." He flinched. It was a mistake. A stupid, arrogant mistake. I was under a lot of pressure. Tiffany meant nothing. "It's you I love, Cat. It's our family, our child." He leaned forward, trying to project sincerity. "We can fix this. We can stop the lawyers. We can tell the world it was all a publicity stunt gone wrong. We can be a family." It was a masterful performance, the kind that had worked on her for years. But the woman sitting before him was no longer his audience. "It's incredible, Richard," she said, shaking her head with a sort of academic curiosity. "You really believe your own lies, don't you? You're not sorry you did it. You're sorry you got caught. You're sorry you miscalculated." His facade began to crack. "And what? You found a richer Prince Charming to rescue you?" He sneered, gesturing toward Sebastian. Sebastian turned from the window, his expression unreadable. "This has nothing to do with me, Richard. This is about the choices you made. I'm simply here to ensure Catherine's choices are respected and protected." "My choice," Catherine said. "Picking up the file folder is to end this. Cleanly and quickly." She slid the folder across the coffee table. "This is a post-nuptial settlement offer. It's generous. It leaves you with your company, or what's left of it, and enough seed money to start again. In return, you will give me sole ownership of this apartment, full custody of our child, and you will walk away without a fight." Richard scoffed, opening the folder. "You're in no position to make demands. My lawyers will drag this out for years. I'll paint you as an unstable, vindictive gold digger who ran off with another man." Catherine met his gaze, and for the first time he saw a glimmer of the formidable woman Sebastian had always known. "No, Richard. You won't, because this isn't Act 1. This is Act 2. She nodded to Sebastian. He picked up a tablet from the side table and placed it next to the folder. He tapped the screen and a spreadsheet filled the display. It was a detailed flow chart of transactions tracing money from Vance Holdings' accounts through 3 shell corporations and into a private offshore account in the Cayman Islands. An account under Richard's name alone. The total was just over $50 million. Money he had systematically embezzled from his own company over the past 3 years. Richard froze, his face turning ashen. Where did you get that?" "You were so busy building your gilded cage." "Richard, you forgot that some people build the keys," Sebastian said quietly. "My cybersecurity team is very, very good. This is a complete record of your fraud, undeniable and prosecutable." Catherine leaned forward. "So this is Act 3, Richard. Your choice. You can either sign the settlement, walk away, and try to salvage your professional life. Or I can hand this tablet over to the SEC and the District Attorney's office. If you choose that path, you won't be fighting for your company. You'll be fighting for your freedom. You won't be paying lawyers. You'll be paying for commissary privileges. The life you know will be over. The room was silent. Richard stared at the tablet, at the undeniable methodical proof of his crimes. He had been so arrogant, so sure of his own cleverness. He had never imagined someone could simply peel back the layers of his deception with such ease. He looked at Catherine, truly looked at her. He saw the strength he had tried to extinguish, the intelligence he had willfully ignored. He saw the mother of his child, a woman he had wronged so profoundly that she was now holding a gun to the head of his entire existence. And he saw that there was no remorse in her eyes, only resolution. He had been playing checkers, they had been playing chess, and this was checkmate. Slowly, his hand trembling, Richard reached for the pen that Eleanor Vance had so thoughtfully included with the settlement documents. He uncapped it, the click echoing in the silent room like a gunshot. Without another word, he signed away his marriage, his home, and his future, all to save himself from his past. 9 months later, the first snow of winter was dusting the windows of a beautiful brownstone overlooking a quiet, tree-lined street in Greenwich Village. The home was filled not with a cavernous, echoing silence, but with the warm, gentle sounds of a new life, the soft cooing of a baby, the gentle rock of a cradle, the quiet murmur of a mother's voice. Catherine held her son Nicholas in her arms, his tiny fingers wrapped around one of hers. He had her eyes, but a peacefulness that was all his own. The penthouse on the Upper East Side had been sold. The proceeds, along with the generous settlement, had been placed in a trust for Nicholas, and had allowed Catherine to buy this house, a place that felt like a home, not a showroom. The saga of Richard Vance had concluded not with a dramatic bang, but with a series of pathetic whimpers. The SEC, tipped off by an anonymous source, had launched a full-scale investigation into Vance Holdings anyway. Richard, stripped of his CEO title and facing shareholder lawsuits, had been forced to sell his controlling stake in the company for pennies on the dollar to a competitor. He had avoided prison time, but he was ruined, a pariah in the world he had once ruled. The last Catherine had heard, he was living in a rented condo in Florida, attempting to launch a new venture that no one would fund. Tiffany Sterling, after her lawsuit was summarily dismissed, had disappeared from the social scene, her 15 minutes of infamy having expired. The Starlight Collier had been quietly returned to Cartier. Penelope was a constant welcome presence, a doting aunt to Nicholas, who arrived with organic baby food and scandalous art world gossip in equal measure. And Sebastian was simply there. He had been her rock, her confidant, and her fiercest protector throughout the divorce and the pregnancy. He had asked for nothing in return. Their relationship had rekindled, slowly, cautiously built not on the ashes of her old life, but on the solid ground of their shared history and mutual respect. There was no pressure, no expectation. He would come over for dinner, hold Nicholas, with a natural ease that surprised them both, and talk with Catherine for hours about everything and nothing. He was rebuilding her trust, not just in him, but in the very idea of a partnership. One evening, as they sat in the quiet living room, the baby sleeping peacefully in his bassinet by the fireplace, Sebastian looked at her. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked gently. The glamour, the galas. The power, Catherine considered the question. She thought of the cold, perfect penthouse, the heavy jewels, the constant performance. She remembered the gnawing emptiness that had been her constant companion. Then she looked around her cozy living room at the overflowing bookshelves, the half-finished painting on an easel in the corner. She had started painting again, and the sleeping baby, who was the center of her universe. "I didn't have power, Sebastian," she said, her voice clear and certain. "I was adjacent to power. I was an accessory to it. There's a difference." She met his gaze, a warm, genuine smile gracing her lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. "This is power. Choosing my own life. Building a real home. Raising my son in peace. This is everything." He reached across the space between them and took her hand. His touch was warm and steady. It wasn't a gesture of possession or passion, but of deep, abiding friendship that was slowly, beautifully blooming into something more. It was a promise not of a gilded cage, but of an open door. Outside, the snow fell blanketing the city in a clean, white slate. For Catherine Vance, it was not an ending, but a new dawn. She had walked through the fire of a public betrayal and emerged not burned but forged. She was a mother, an artist, a survivor. And for the first time in a very long time, she was free. The future was unwritten, and she held the pen. And that's how one woman turned the worst night of her life into the beginning of her best one. It's a story that proves that true strength isn't about avoiding the fall. It's about how you rise. Catherine's journey from a heartbroken wife to an unbreakable mother shows us that sometimes you have to lose the life you planned to find, the one you were always meant to live. What did you think of her incredible transformation? Could you have been as brave as she was? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, if this story of resilience and reclamation moved you. Please give this video a thumbs up, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Click that notification bell so you never miss a single story of justice and empowerment. The gavel fell, its sharp crack lost in the cavernous silence of the ornate courtroom. All eyes were on Thomas Braddock, a man whose expensive suit couldn't conceal the ugliness twisting his handsome features. He pointed a trembling manicured finger not at the opposing counsel, but at his own pregnant wife, Felicia. She was a mistake. He spat the venomous words echoing off the polished marble. A disastrous, regrettable mistake. And that thing she's carrying is a mistake I refuse to pay for. A wave of gasps rippled through the gallery. But the real drama wasn't in his calculated cruelty. It was in the worn, leather-bound folder the judge had just placed on his bench. A folder containing the last will and testament of the one man Thomas could never bully his late father. The air in courtroom 4B of the San Mateo County Superior Court was thick with the perfume of old money and fresh animosity. It was a sterile, impersonal space, all mahogany panels and muted grey carpeting, yet it had become the arena for the deeply personal evisceration of a marriage. Felicia Vale, soon to be she hoped, Felicia Vale once more sat ramrod straight in her cushioned chair. Her hands resting protectively over the pronounced swell of her stomach were the only part of her that betrayed the tremor running through her body. At 32, she still possessed the quiet, bookish beauty that had first caught Thomas Braddock's eye. Thoughtful grey eyes, a cascade of chestnut hair she'd simply pinned back and a complexion that had never needed the heavy-handed ministrations of the Braddock family's preferred aestheticians. Today, however, that beauty was shadowed by a weariness that went bone deep. She felt less like a person and more like a legal exhibit, the pregnant wife. Across the aisle, Thomas Braddock sat flanked by his lawyer, a shark in a Savile Row suit named Sterling, and his mother, Isabella Braddock. Thomas was the picture of wounded pride, his jaw tight, his brow furrowed in a performance of aggrieved masculinity. He was, Felicia had once thought, devastatingly handsome. Now she saw the weakness in his chin, the petulance in the downturn of his lips. He was a boy playing at being a king, and his mother Isabella was the silent, unyielding power behind the throne. Isabella Braddock was a masterpiece of preserved aristocracy. Her silver hair was coiffed into a helmet of glacial perfection. Her pearls were real, her Chanel suit was vintage, and her disdain was palpable. She hadn't looked at Felicia once, preferring to stare at the judge as if he were a tardy waiter. From the moment Thomas had brought Felicia home to the sprawling Braddock estate in Atherton, Isabella had treated her not as a future daughter-in-law, but as a hostile takeover bid. Felicia wasn't old money. Her father was a history professor, her mother a librarian. To the Braddocks, whose wealth stretched back to the railroad barons, Felicia was a curious little commoner, a temporary amusement for their heir. Mr. Braddock, Judge Albright, said, his voice a low gravel that commanded attention. He was a man in his 60s, with a weary face that had seen every flavor of human depravity. We are here to discuss the division of assets in your divorce proceedings. Let's try to maintain a certain level of decorum. Thomas's lawyer, Mr. Sterling, rose smoothly. Your Honor, my client's emotional state is merely a reflection of the deep betrayal he has suffered. He entered into this marriage in good faith, only to find Felicia's lawyer, a kind but firm woman named Maria Davies, cut him off. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is testifying. The betrayal Mr. Sterling refers to is my client's discovery that the prenuptial agreement Mr. Braddock forced upon her was not only unconscionable, but deliberately misleading. The prenup. The infamous document Isabella had presented to Felicia a week before the wedding. It had been an ambush styled as a casual chat over tea in the solarium. Just a formality, dear, Isabella had purred, sliding the thick document across the glass table. A way to keep things tidy. We wouldn't want any misunderstandings down the line. Thomas had backed his mother, of course. It's just how things are done, Ellie, he'd said, avoiding her eyes. It doesn't mean anything. It had meant everything. It had stipulated that in the event of a divorce, Felicia would walk away with nothing. Not a penny of the Braddock fortune, no claim to their properties, not even alimony. At the time, blinded by love and a naive belief in their future, she had signed it. Now, with a child on the way, a Braddock heir, the document was a cudgel they were using to beat her into submission. They offered her a one-time payout of $50,000 and a non-disclosure agreement so restrictive it would essentially erase her from their history. The validity of the prenuptial agreement is what we are here to debate. Judge Albright stated, his gaze fixed on Thomas. But your personal feelings about your wife are for the moment irrelevant. This seemed to be the wrong thing to say. Thomas, who had been simmering, suddenly boiled over. He stood up, knocking his chair back slightly. Irrelevant, he scoffed, his voice rising. She is the most relevant mistake I've ever made. I was trapped. My father was ill, he was fond of her for some reason, and I went along with it. He gestured wildly towards Felicia. She's a gold digger, Your Honor. A clever little parasite who saw a meal ticket and latched on. Maria Davies was on her feet. "Your Honor, this is outrageous." But the judge simply raised a hand, silencing her. He was watching Thomas, his expression unreadable. And Thomas, emboldened by the attention, took a step forward. He locked eyes with Felicia, and the mask of the charming, carefree man she had married fell away completely, revealing the snarling, entitled creature beneath. "Do you know what she did?" He addressed the judge, but his words were daggers aimed at her heart. "She got pregnant on purpose. After I told her we should wait. After I told her things were not working out. She did it to trap me, to try and secure a piece of my family's legacy." Felicia felt the blood drain from her face. It was a lie. A vicious, calculated lie. They had been trying for a baby. It was Thomas who had been excited, who had talked about names, who had held her, and whispered dreams of their future family into her hair. That was before his father Arthur Braddock had passed away 2 months ago. Before Isabella had sunk her claws back into her son's soul. Then came the words that would be seared into her memory forever. Thomas's voice dropped, becoming low and guttural, dripping with a contempt so profound it physically hurt her. "She was a mistake," he repeated, pointing at her belly. "And that thing she's carrying is a mistake I refuse to pay for." A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. Felicia felt it like a physical blow. The baby inside her, their child, kicked as if in protest. Tears welled hot and fast, blurring the cruel face of the man she had loved. She saw Isabella smirk, a flicker of triumphant malice. This was what they wanted. To break her. To humiliate her so completely she would crawl away and accept their scraps. "That is enough." "Mr. Braddock." Judge Albright's voice was no longer weary. It was thunder. He slammed his gavel down, the sound echoing the shattering of Felicia's world. "That is more than enough. You will sit down now." Thomas, looking slightly stunned by his own outburst, sank back into his chair, though his hateful glare remained fixed on Felicia. Judge Albright surveyed the scene, his eyes lingering on Felicia's tear-streaked face, then on Isabella's smug one. He took a deep, steadying breath and squared a stack of papers on his bench. "This court is in recess for 15 minutes, he announced. "However, before we break, a matter has been brought to my attention this morning by the executor of the late Arthur Braddock's estate." At the mention of his father, Thomas sat up straighter. A flicker of something confusion, perhaps apprehension, crossed his face. The judge picked up the worn, leather-bound folder. "It appears that Mr. Arthur Braddock's final will and testament, executed 1 month prior to his death, contains certain stipulations that have a direct and material bearing on the assets currently under discussion in this divorce. With the executor's permission, and given its relevance, I am unsealing it now." He opened the folder. The silence in the courtroom returned, but this time it was different. It was thick with confusion and a dawning electric tension. A will, Arthur's will, had been read weeks ago. It was simple, leaving everything to his only son Thomas, with a generous trust for Isabella. What was this? Felicia wiped her tears, her heart pounding a strange new rhythm. Arthur. Kind, gentle Arthur. He had been the only Braddock who had ever truly seen her, the only one who had ever been on her side. In his final months, as his illness worsened, he would often ask her to sit with him in the garden, away from the oppressive gloom of the mansion and the even more oppressive presence of his wife. They would talk for hours about history, about books, about her dreams for the future. He seemed to understand her in a way Thomas never had. "What is the meaning of this, Your Honor?" Mr. Sterling asked, his composure ruffled for the first time. "A new will. We were not informed," it would seem Mr. Sterling, the judge, said, peering over his spectacles at the document, that no one was. Arthur Braddock was a very thorough man. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room, and began to read. As Judge Albright's voice began to drone through the legalese of the will's preamble, Felicia's mind spun backwards, away from the sterile cruelty of the courtroom to the sun-dappled lawns of the Braddock estate. She remembered the first time she'd met Arthur Braddock. It was 1.5 years ago. Thomas had brought her to the family's annual summer gala, a lavish affair of champagne fountains and string quartets. She'd been terrified a simple librarian's daughter adrift in a sea of couture and condescension. Isabella had introduced her with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her tone making Felicia Vale sound like a quaint, unlisted company. Felicia had escaped to the rose garden, overwhelmed when she found a man in a tweed jacket, his back to her, carefully pruning a climbing rose. He turned, and his eyes, a startlingly clear blue, held a warmth that was entirely absent from the main party. This was Arthur Braddock. "Ah, you've found my hiding spot," he'd said with a gentle smile. "Don't worry, I won't tell if you don't." They talked for nearly an hour. He didn't ask about her family's money or connections. He asked what she was reading. He asked about her work at the San Francisco Public Library, his face lighting up when she described her passion for historical archives. He spoke of his own love for history, a passion he lamented his son did not share. Thomas sees history as a list of assets acquired, Arthur had said, with a sad, knowing sigh. He sees the names Rockefeller, Carnegie, Braddock. But he doesn't understand the stories, the humanity. In that single conversation, Arthur had shown her more genuine interest and kindness than Isabella had in 6 months of strained dinners. He saw her not as an attachment to his son, but as a person. Over the next year, he became her quiet ally in the gilded cage of the Braddock family. While Isabella laid subtle traps and Thomas grew more distant under his mother's influence, Arthur would seek Felicia out. He'd leave a rare first-edition book on her bedside table or invite her to walk the grounds, sharing stories of the family that were not about wealth, but about love, loss, and folly. He was already ill then, a creeping lung disease that stole his breath but never his sharp intellect. As his condition worsened, the dynamic in the house shifted. Isabella became more controlling, treating her husband's illness as an inconvenience and tightening her grip on Thomas. The pregnancy had been a brief, shining moment of hope. Thomas had been ecstatic at first. It was his idea, a way to, as he'd put it, finally start our own family away from all the pressure. They'd celebrated with a trip to Big Sur, away from the oppressive atmosphere of the estate. He had put his hands on her still flat stomach and spoken of a future that felt real and full of love. The moment they returned, Isabella shattered it. Felicia overheard the argument from the top of the grand staircase. A baby. Isabella's voice was like ice. "Now, Thomas, you are an imbecile. You have no idea what you've done." "Mother, it's my child. Our child. I love Ellie." "Love," she'd scoffed. "You are infatuated with a librarian, Thomas, a nobody. And now she has tethered herself to our legacy with the oldest trick in the book. Do you think for 1 second she wasn't planning this? To tie you down, to make herself indispensable." The poison took root quickly. Thomas began to pull away. He started spending more time at the office, coming home late, smelling of expensive whiskey and another woman's perfume. The excuses were flimsy, the apologies hollow. He grew short-tempered, echoing his mother's criticisms. He'd comment on Felicia's clothes, her friends, her lack of ambition. Then Arthur's health took a steep decline. In his last weeks, he was confined to his bed. The house was somber and quiet. Isabella managed his care with ruthless efficiency, keeping visitors to a minimum. But Arthur would still ask for Felicia. One afternoon, just a month before he died, he beckoned her close. His breathing was labored, but his eyes were lucid. "Felicia," he rasped, taking her hand. His own was frail, all paper-thin skin and bone. "Don't let them break you. You have more strength than any of them." He'd looked pointedly at her stomach. "And you have a responsibility to that child, a responsibility to be strong." He'd made her promise. She hadn't understood the full weight of his words then. 2 weeks later, he summoned his personal attorney, a man Felicia had never met, to the house. Isabella had been furious, trying to insist that the family lawyer, Mr. Sterling, be present. Arthur, with a surprising burst of strength, had refused. "This is a private matter, Isabella," he'd said. The meeting had lasted for 3 hours. The next day Arthur seemed more at peace. He passed away in his sleep a month later. The first reading of the will had been exactly what everyone expected. A simple document leaving Braddock Enterprises and the bulk of the estate to Thomas. Isabella was granted a lifelong right to live in the family mansion and a generous stipend from a separate trust. It was so straightforward that Thomas had smirked a look of vindicated relief on his face. With his father gone, the final obstacle to his absolute inheritance and Isabella's absolute influence was removed. 2 days after that, Thomas had asked for a divorce. The words were cold, rehearsed. He'd said the marriage was a mistake, that he'd been pressured by his father's failing health. He presented it as a clean break, a return to the natural order of things. When Felicia, heartbroken and 7 months pregnant, had refused to be discarded so easily, he had turned vicious. The battle over the prenup began, and now here they were. A sharp intake of breath from Mr. Sterling snapped Felicia back to the present. Judge Albright had finished with the preliminary sections of the will. His eyes scanned the room before continuing. "We now come to Article 4. The judge said, his voice dropping slightly, drawing every ounce of attention in the room. "Regarding the disposition of my primary asset, my controlling interest in Braddock Enterprises Incorporated." Thomas leaned forward, a smug look returning to his face. This was it, the confirmation of his kingdom. "I, Arthur Braddock," the judge read his voice, clear and deliberate, "being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare the following. My son Thomas Braddock has in recent months shown a lamentable lack of judgment and a character ill-suited to the stewardship of the company my grandfather built." A jolt went through the room. Thomas's face went from smug to slack-jawed shock. Isabella's carefully constructed composure cracked her mouth, falling open slightly. What Thomas whispered the word stolen by the cavernous room. The judge continued, his voice unwavering. "He has proven himself to be easily manipulated and has forgotten the most fundamental principle of our family's success, that our name is built on integrity, not just on assets. Therefore, I cannot in good conscience deliver the future of Braddock Enterprises into his hands." "This is insane," Sterling blurted out, rising to his feet. "Your Honor, my client's father was clearly not of sound mind. He was heavily medicated. He was certified of sound mind by 2 independent physicians, the day this will was signed, Mr. Sterling. Their affidavits are attached, Judge Albright said coolly, not even looking up. Now sit down. Sterling sank back into his chair, his face pale. The judge's eyes found Felicia's across the room. She held his gaze, her heart hammering against her ribs. He went on. Therefore, I hereby bequeath my entire controlling share of Braddock Enterprises, representing 51% of the voting stock, not to my son, but to a trust. This trust shall be known as the Arthur Vale Braddock Legacy Trust. Vale. He had used her maiden name. A low guttural sound escaped Isabella's throat. The judge continued reading the clause that would change everything. The sole beneficiary of this trust is to be my first-born grandchild, the child currently carried by my daughter-in-law, Felicia Vale Braddock. The courtroom devolved into a cacophony of frantic whispers. Thomas looked as if he'd been struck by lightning, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. He stared at Felicia's belly, not with contempt, but with a dawning, horrified awe. That mistake, was now the majority shareholder of his entire inheritance. But Arthur Braddock wasn't finished. The final killing blow was yet to come. Judge Albright looked up from the document, his gaze passing over Thomas and Isabella, before settling once more on Felicia. He read the last sentence of the article, his voice ringing with a profound posthumous finality. The sole executor and trustee of this trust, vested with absolute and unconditional authority over all voting rights, board appointments, and financial decisions of Braddock Enterprises, until the beneficiary reaches the age of 25, shall be the child's mother, and my trusted daughter-in-law, Felicia Vale Braddock. For a long moment, the world stopped. The frantic whispers died. The rustling of papers ceased. The only sound in courtroom 4B was the frantic, trapped beat of Felicia's own heart. She stared at Judge Albright, certain she had misheard, that the grief and stress had finally caused her to hallucinate. Sole executor and trustee. Absolute and unconditional authority. The words didn't compute. They were abstract alien concepts that didn't belong to her. Felicia Vale, the librarian, the spurned wife, the humiliated mother-to-be. Then the spell broke. A strangled cry tore from Isabella Braddock's throat. It was a sound of pure, undiluted fury, the cry of a queen who has just watched her castle crumble into dust. "No, it's a lie, a forgery!" she shrieked, lurching to her feet. Her mask of aristocratic control was gone, replaced by a visage of raw, twitching rage. That woman, that scheming little harlot, she manipulated him. She poisoned my husband against his own family. Mr. Sterling, his face the color of ash, tried to restrain her, whispering urgently. "Isabella, not here. Control yourself." But she was beyond control. She pointed a trembling, diamond-clad finger at Felicia. This was your plan all along. You seduced a dying old man, twisted his mind." "Mrs. Braddock." Judge Albright's voice cracked like a whip. "You are on the verge of being held in contempt. Another outburst like that, and you will be removed by the bailiff." Isabella snapped her mouth shut, but her chest heaved, and her eyes fixed on Felicia promised retribution. Thomas was eerily silent. He sat frozen, his body rigid, his eyes wide and vacant. He was staring at the polished table in front of him, but he wasn't seeing it. He was seeing his entire world, the one he had been promised from birth, vanish before his eyes. The kingdom he was meant to inherit, the power he was meant to wield, had just been handed lock, stock, and barrel to the woman he had publicly disavowed, and the unborn child he had branded a mistake. Felicia's lawyer, Maria Davies, leaned over her, voice a low, steady murmur in Felicia's ear. "Felicia, did you hear that? Do you understand what this means?" Felicia could only shake her head slowly, her mind a whirlwind of shock. She looked from Thomas's shattered expression to Isabella's murderous glare. She felt a kick, a strong, solid thump from within, a reminder of the tiny, unknowing beneficiary at the center of this cataclysm. Judge Albright, seemingly unfazed by the eruption, continued as if reading a grocery list. "The will goes on to state," he said, his voice cutting through the residual tension, "that Thomas Braddock is to be granted a salaried position as President of Operations, reporting directly to the Board of Directors. A board that the new trustee," he paused, looking directly at Felicia, "has the sole authority to appoint or dismiss." The implication was brutally clear. Thomas was no longer the heir apparent. He was an employee who could be fired. By her. Furthermore, the judge added, "The will stipulates that Thomas Braddock and Isabella Braddock are permitted to maintain residence in the Atherton family home, but only with the express ongoing permission of the trustee. The deed and title of the property are to be transferred to the Arthur Vale Braddock Legacy Trust." They were tenants in their own home. Their right to live there was now entirely at Felicia's discretion. The finality of it was absolute. Arthur hadn't just disinherited his son. He had orchestrated a complete coup d'etat from beyond the grave. He had seen the cruelty, the weakness, the greed, and he had built a fortress to protect his grandchild and the woman he believed could safeguard his legacy. He hadn't just given Felicia a shield, he had given her a sword, an arsenal, an entire kingdom. The will Judge Albright concluded, closing the leather folder with a soft thud, "is accompanied by a signed and notarized letter from Arthur Braddock detailing his reasons. It explains his concerns over his son's profligate spending, his susceptibility to his mother's corrosive influence, and his cruel and dishonorable treatment of his pregnant wife. The letter states, and I quote, "I have observed Felicia for 2 years. She possesses an integrity my son sorely lacks. She is intelligent, compassionate, and her loyalty is not to money but to family. I do not give her this power to punish my son, but to protect my grandchild. I trust her to do what is right." The judge looked at Thomas. "The letter also expresses hope, Mr. Braddock, that this drastic but necessary action will provide you with an opportunity to rediscover the man you were meant to be, not the man your mother wants you to be." That last line was a dagger meant for Isabella, and it hit its mark. She flinched as if struck. Judge Albright removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Given these revelations," he stated, his voice returning to its official, dispassionate tone, "the financial landscape of this divorce has been fundamentally altered. The prenuptial agreement is now entirely moot, as the primary assets Mr. Braddock believed were his to protect are in fact not his. The $50,000 settlement offered to Mrs. Braddock is, to put it mildly, insufficient." He looked at Felicia, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something almost like a smile in his tired eyes. "In fact, Mrs. Braddock is now, for all intents and purposes, the single most powerful financial entity in this room. The assets belong to the trust she controls." He turned to the stunned lawyers. "I am dissolving these proceedings for today. I suggest you all go home, absorb the contents of this will, and reschedule when you have a more realistic grasp of your clients' respective situations. Mr. Sterling," he added pointedly, "you may want to advise your client that his wife's mistake now controls his salary, his home, and his future. A bit of humility might be in order." With a final sharp rap of the gavel, he declared, "Court is adjourned." The judge rose and swept out of the room, leaving a vortex of stunned silence in his wake. For a moment, no one moved. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, chaos erupted. Reporters who had been lurking in the gallery rushed towards the doors. Sterling was frantically trying to speak to Thomas, who was still catatonic. Maria Davies was patting Felicia's shoulder, her face a mixture of shock and elation. Felicia slowly got to her feet, her legs unsteady. She felt dizzy, disconnected from her own body. Isabella was the first to move towards her, her face a terrifying mask of fury. She stalked across the aisle, her heels clicking like gunshots on the marble floor. "You will not get away with this," Isabella hissed, her voice low and venomous, close enough for Felicia to smell her cloyingly expensive perfume. "I will fight this. I will prove you are an unfit mother. I will drag your name through so much mud you'll drown in it. That baby will never see a penny." Before Felicia could react, a figure stepped between them. It was Thomas. His face was ashen, his eyes wild with a desperate, frantic energy. He looked from his mother to Felicia, then back again. "Mother, stop," he said, his voice hoarse. "Just stop." He then turned to Felicia. The contempt was gone, replaced by a raw, pleading panic. The man who not 20 minutes ago had called her and their child a mistake now looked at her as if she were a lifeline. "Ellie," he began, his voice cracking. He even reached a hand out as if to touch her arm before letting it fall. "Ellie, I didn't mean it. You have to believe me. I was angry. I was pressured." His eyes flickered towards his mother. "We can fix this, you and me. We can stop the divorce. We can raise the baby together, in our house." The audacity of it was breathtaking. The whiplash of his transformation from tyrant to supplicant was so sudden it was nauseating. He wasn't apologizing for the cruelty. He was trying to reverse a transaction that had gone horribly wrong for him. He didn't see a wife he had wounded. He saw the new CEO of his life. Felicia looked at his desperate, pleading face. She looked at Isabella, who was watching them with narrowed, calculating eyes, her mind already plotting new strategies. And she felt nothing. Not love, not hate, not even anger anymore. Just a profound, chilling emptiness where her love for him used to be. She looked at his outstretched, trembling hand. Then she looked him directly in the eye, her own gaze clear and steady for the first time that day. Without a word, she turned and walked away, leaving her husband and his mother standing in the ruins of their fallen kingdom. Her lawyer Maria rushed to her side, and together they walked out of the courtroom. Not towards a miserable, uncertain future, but towards an empire Felicia had never asked for, but now, by the grace of a good man's final act, commanded. The days that followed the courtroom bombshell were a blur of surreal adjustments. Felicia didn't return to the small rented apartment she had secured as a refuge from her marriage. Maria Davies had insisted it wasn't secure enough. "You're not just a private citizen anymore, Felicia," she'd said, her tone urgent. "You are the head of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. There are protocols now." And so Felicia found herself in a gilded prison of a different sort, a penthouse suite at the Four Seasons paid for by the Arthur Vale Braddock Legacy Trust, with a round-the-clock security detail stationed in the hallway, lawyers, trust officers, and financial advisors. Men and women with sharp suits and even sharper minds. All remnants of Arthur's loyal inner circle paraded through her living room. They presented her with binders thick with financial reports, organizational charts, and legal obligations. They used terms like fiduciary duty, hostile takeover defenses, and quarterly earnings projections. At first, it was overwhelmingly intimidating. She was Felicia Vale, who found comfort in the Dewey Decimal System, not the Dow Jones Industrial Average. But as they spoke, she listened. She asked questions, simple ones at first, then more complex ones. And she discovered something surprising. The logic of it, the intricate web of cause and effect, wasn't so different from tracing historical events or archival records. It was a story just told in the language of numbers. More importantly, she was fueled by a powerful clarifying force, the memory of Arthur's words, "I trust her to do what is right," and the visceral, soul-crushing memory of Thomas's "that thing she's carrying is a mistake." One was a sacred trust, the other a declaration of war. She would honor the former by prevailing in the latter. Her phone rang incessantly. The calls were from Thomas. He left dozens of voicemails, each one more desperate than the last. They were a pathetic symphony of panicked apologies and self-serving promises. "Ellie, baby, please pick up. I'm so sorry. I've been such a fool. My mother, she gets in my head. But that's over now, I swear. I was just looking at the crib we ordered. Remember the one from that little shop in Carmel? It's all about us, Ellie. You, me, and our little boy. Or girl. It's all that matters. I told Sterling to fire his legal team. We don't need lawyers. We're a family. Just come home. Please, just come home, and we can figure this all out." She never answered. She never listened to a single message, twice. It was the desperate pleading of a man who had lost his wallet, not a husband who had broken his wife's heart. Isabella, for her part, had gone to ground. But it was a tactical silence, not a surrender. Maria's legal team reported that Isabella had hired a new, notoriously aggressive law firm, specializing in contesting wills. They were digging, searching for any doctor who would testify to Arthur's incompetence, any nurse who would claim Felicia had restricted access to him, any scrap of dirt they could find, to paint her as a manipulative usurper. A week after the hearing, Felicia knew she couldn't stay in the hotel forever. She had to make a move. The trust owned the Braddock mansion. It was her house now. More importantly, it was her child's house. Arthur had not intended for his grandchild to be raised in exile. So she made a decision. She called Maria. "I'm going home," she said, her voice firm. "Felicia is that wise. It's not about wisdom, Maria. It's about a clear message. The Queen is not in hiding." The return was as dramatic as she had intended. She didn't sneak in the back door. She arrived in a black town car, arranged by the trust which swept up the long gravel driveway to the imposing facade of the Atherton mansion. As she stepped out of the car, the heavy front doors opened. Thomas stood there, his face a mixture of hope and terror. He had clearly been watching for her. He was dressed down in a cashmere sweater, an attempt to look soft, approachable. "Ellie." He breathed a relieved smile, touching his lips. "You're home." "I am," Felicia said, her tone cool and level. She walked past him into the cavernous marble-floored foyer. The air was still and smelled of lemon polish and lilies, just as it always had. "I've asked a moving company to clear out my old things from the guest wing. They will be delivering my new furniture for the nursery this afternoon." Thomas's smile faltered. "Of course, anything you want. I had Mrs. Albright air out the master suite for you. For us." Felicia stopped and turned to him. "Let's be very clear, Thomas. I am not here to reconcile. I am here because this is my home now. It belongs to the trust that I command. You and your mother are living here at my discretion." The words hung in the air, cold and hard. The color drained from Thomas's face. "My legal team," she continued, her voice devoid of emotion, "will be drawing up a tenancy at will agreement for you and Isabella. It will stipulate the terms of your continued residence. Furthermore, I am calling a board meeting for Braddock Enterprises for Monday morning. As president of operations, your attendance will be required. You'll be expected to present a full report on the company's current standing." She was no longer his wife. She was his landlord and his boss. The reality of it slammed into him, and his composure finally shattered. "Felicia, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "Don't do this. Don't be like this. This isn't you. You're not this cold." "You're right," she said, looking him straight in the eye. "The woman I was would have forgiven you. She would have believed your lies and let you hurt her again. But you and your mother killed that woman. You stood in a court of law, and you killed her. So you'll have to get used to the woman who is left." Just then a sharp, imperious voice echoed from the top of the grand staircase. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" Isabella stood there, wrapped in a silk dressing gown, her face a thunderous mask. Felicia didn't even grant her a full glance. "Hello, Isabella," she said, her voice carrying easily in the grand space. "I'm home. I trust your new lawyers have explained the situation to you. You're a guest here. Try not to forget it." She turned and began to walk towards the east wing, where Arthur's private study was located. It had been her sanctuary with him, and it would now be her command center. "You will regret this," Isabella shrieked from the landing. "I will see you on the street." Felicia paused, her back still to them. "No, you won't," she said without turning around. "You will see me in the boardroom, Monday at 9 a.m. Don't be late." And with that, she walked away, leaving mother and son standing in the opulent foyer of a house that was no longer theirs, silenced by the quiet, unshakable authority of the woman they had tried and failed to destroy. The following months were a masterclass in trench warfare, fought not with bullets, but with board appointments and legal briefs. Felicia, now 8 and then 9 months pregnant, moved not with the timid uncertainty of a librarian, but with the deliberate, focused strategy of a general. Arthur's study became her war room. Its rich, leather-bound books on military history and corporate biography now seemed less like a collection and more like a curated library of tactics left for her by a brilliant mentor. Her first move was the board meeting. She walked into the Braddock Enterprises boardroom, a long, intimidating chamber dominated by a colossal mahogany table and portraits of stern-faced Braddock men, and every head turned. The existing board members, all cronies of Thomas and Isabella, looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and thinly veiled contempt. Thomas sat at the head of the table, a place he had occupied for less than 3 months. Felicia, guided by Maria, and the Trust's chief counsel, took the seat directly opposite him. She didn't claim his chair. She created a new center of power. She let Thomas run through his report, a rambling, jargon-filled presentation clearly designed to intimidate and confuse her. When he finished, he looked at her, a challenge in his eyes. Felicia didn't respond directly to his report. Instead, she introduced the Trust's counsel, who then calmly and methodically laid out the legal reality of the new ownership structure. Then Felicia spoke. "Thank you, Thomas, for that overview," she said, her voice calm and clear, carrying to every corner of the room. "In my capacity as trustee, My primary duty is to ensure the long-term health and integrity of this company for the sole beneficiary. To that end, I have spent the last week reviewing the company's performance, its leadership and its vision, and I have found it lacking. She paused, letting the word hang in the air. Effective immediately, I am exercising my authority as trustee to reconstitute the board of directors. Mr. Henderson, Ms. Albright, Mr. Chen, she said, naming 3 of Isabella's oldest and most loyal allies. Your positions on this board are terminated. Thank you for your service. The 3 of them stared aghast. You can't do that, one of them sputtered. She can, and she has, the trust's lawyer interjected smoothly. Felicia continued, her gaze sweeping the table. In their place, I am appointing 3 new members. First, Ms. Maria Davies, whose legal expertise will be invaluable. Second, Mr. Alistair Finch. She named Arthur's long-time, fiercely loyal financial advisor, a man Isabella had forced into retirement. And third, Dr. Lena Petrova, a leading expert in sustainable business ethics from Stanford University. Arthur Braddock often spoke of creating a legacy, not just a profit margin. We will honor that vision. It was a coup. Clean, swift, and utterly devastating. She had decapitated Isabella's power base within the company in less than 5 minutes. Thomas sat impotent, watching his allies pack their briefcases in stunned silence. He was still president, but he was now a president who answered to a board that was loyal to her. Life in the mansion was a silent, cold war. Felicia took over the master wing, while Thomas and Isabella were confined to the guest suites. They shared the same roof, passed each other in the long hallways like ghosts, and ate meals at different times to avoid contact. Isabella's attempts at psychological warfare, leaving old happy photos of her and Thomas out making loud, pitying phone calls about poor, confused Felicia, were met with a wall of serene, impenetrable silence. Thomas, meanwhile, swung wildly between pathetic attempts at reconciliation and sullen resentment. He'd leave a single rose on her desk one day, and the next he'd make a sarcastic comment about her playing CEO at the dinner table. Felicia ignored it all. Her focus was singular, the baby and the business. She found an unexpected strength in the routine. She'd wake early, walk the gardens as she had with Arthur, and then spend hours with Alistair Finch, the reappointed advisor. He would patiently walk her through balance sheets and investment portfolios, marveling at her quick grasp of complex ideas. Your father-in-law was right about you, he said one afternoon. You have a formidable mind, Mrs. Braddock. You see the whole chessboard. The one front where Isabella believed she could still win was the legal challenge to the will. Her lawyers filed motion after motion, claiming undue influence and testamentary incapacity. They deposed nurses, gardeners, and cooks, searching for any hint that Felicia had manipulated a dying man. The case was set to be heard by Judge Albright once again. Isabella was confident. She believed, found a star witness, a disgruntled former nurse, whom Isabella had paid handsomely to testify that Felicia had constantly bad-mouthed Thomas and Isabella to Arthur, poisoning his mind in his final days. The day before the hearing, Felicia was in the nursery putting the finishing touches on the room. It was painted a soft, gentle yellow, with a mural of a forest scene on one wall. As she stood there, her hands on her huge belly, feeling the strong, steady kicks of her child, she felt a profound sense of peace. She was ready for whatever came next. That evening, a courier delivered a small sealed package to her. It was from Arthur's personal attorney, the executor of the estate. The accompanying note was brief. Arthur asked me to give this to you if Isabella ever formally contested the will. He called it insurance. Felicia's hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was not a document, but a small, solid-state audio recorder and a single key. Confused, she pressed play. The voice that filled the silent room was Arthur's. It was weak, raspy, clearly recorded in his last weeks, but it was unmistakably him. "If you are hearing this, Felicia," the recording began, "it means Isabella is trying to undo my final wishes. I am not surprised. Her greed has always been her most defining trait. I want you and the court to know the truth." Arthur's recorded voice then detailed with painful clarity Isabella's emotional cruelty throughout their marriage, her constant manipulation of their son, and her open contempt for Felicia. He spoke of how Isabella had tried to bar Felicia from his room, how she had dismissed his doctors and tried to bring in her own specialists who would declare him incompetent. "But the most important evidence," Arthur's voice continued, "is not my words, but hers. Last week, she did not know I had my lawyer install a small recording device in this room, activated by voice. She came in, believing me to be asleep to speak with Thomas. They thought they were alone. The recording is on this device. The key is to my old safe in the study. The evidence inside will corroborate everything." Felicia's blood ran cold. She stopped the recording, her heart pounding. She took the small antique key, went to the study, and opened the safe she never knew existed, hidden behind a false panel of books. Inside was a folder. It contained copies of emails between Isabella and a private investigator she had hired to dig up dirt on Felicia a year ago. It contained financial records showing large payments to the disgruntled nurse. And it contained a second audio recorder. With a deep breath, she pressed play. This time the voices were clearer. It was Isabella and Thomas in Arthur's room, thinking he was sedated and unconscious. Isabella's voice was sharp, cutting. "You have to divorce her the moment he's gone, Thomas. Not a day later. Offer her a pittance. Humiliate her. Make her crawl back to whatever hovel she came from. We cannot have that common bloodline infecting this family." Then Thomas's voice, weak and compliant. "And the baby? What do I do about the baby?" "The baby is a non-issue," Isabella had replied coldly. "We'll claim she trapped you. We'll claim it might not even be yours. We will drag her through a custody battle that will break her. In the end, she'll give it all up just to have peace. The Braddock legacy will remain pure. Your father in his senile state may be fond of her, but we will protect our family from his sentimentality." Felicia sank into a chair, the audio recorder slipping from her fingers. It wasn't just a conspiracy. It was a confession. They had laid out their entire vicious plan in the presence of the very man whose legacy they sought to protect. She now held more than just a defense. She held a weapon of annihilation. The hearing was tomorrow, and she knew exactly what she was going to do. The morning of the hearing was grey and overcast. Isabella Braddock arrived looking imperious and confident, her paid star witness, Nurse Brenda, trailing in her wake. Thomas followed, looking haggard, a man caught in an inescapable vice. Felicia entered last, calm and composed, carrying a simple leather briefcase. Isabella's lawyer, Fletcher, called his witness. Nurse Brenda took the stand and delivered a tearful, practiced performance, painting Felicia as a cunning manipulator who had poisoned a dying, vulnerable Arthur against his loving family. She would whisper insults about Mrs. Braddock and Thomas for hours, the nurse claimed, dabbing a fake tear. She twisted his every thought. It was heartbreaking. When it was Maria Davies's turn, she approached the stand with lethal calm. "Nurse Brenda," she began, "aside from your salary, were you paid any other amounts by Isabella Braddock? Specifically, a sum of $250,000 transferred to an offshore account 2 days after Arthur Braddock's death." The nurse's face went white. Fletcher shot to his feet, shouting objections, but Judge Albright overruled him instantly. "Answer the question, Nurse Brenda." The witness stammered, her lies collapsing under the weight of a single damning question. But this was only the opening salvo. At a nod from Maria, Felicia stood the proud swell of her pregnancy, a silent testament to everything at stake. "Your Honor," Felicia said, her voice ringing with newfound strength, "I would like to present new evidence that will clarify the true nature of the influence surrounding Arthur Braddock in his final days." She opened her briefcase and removed a small audio recorder. "This is a recording made by my father-in-law himself. He left it for me in the event of this exact scenario." She pressed play. Arthur's weak, rasping voice filled the stunned courtroom. He spoke of his faith in Felicia's character and his deep disappointment in his son and wife. A visible shockwave went through the room when he mentioned a second recording, one he had secretly made, of Isabella and Thomas. Isabella's face contorted a mask of dawning horror. "And now," Felicia said, her voice cold as steel, as she held up the second device, the conversation Arthur spoke of, recorded in his room when they believed he was unconscious. She pressed play again. The courtroom was plunged into a chilling silence, broken only by the recorded voices of mother and son plotting Felicia's destruction. Isabella's voice, crisp and cruel. "You have to divorce her the moment he's gone. Humiliate her. Make her crawl. We cannot have that common bloodline infecting this family." Then Thomas, weak and complicit. "And the baby? What do I do about the baby?" And the final monstrous words from Isabella. "The baby is a non-issue. We'll claim it might not even be yours. We will drag her through a custody battle that will break her." The recording ended. The silence that followed was absolute and condemning. Isabella was frozen in her chair, her face a grotesque tableau of public exposure and private ruin. Thomas had buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. His lawyer sat down, utterly defeated. Judge Albright stared at Isabella, his face a mask of cold fury. "Mrs. Braddock," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "what you have just heard in your own words is a monstrous conspiracy to commit perjury and destroy an innocent woman. And you," he said, turning his glare on Thomas, "your cowardice is contemptible." He slammed his gavel, the sound like a gunshot. "The challenge to this will is dismissed with extreme prejudice. I am fining Mrs. Isabella Braddock $500,000 for malicious prosecution. And I am forwarding this audio evidence to the district attorney's office for investigation into potential criminal charges." His expression softened only when he looked at Felicia. "Mrs. Braddock, you have endured a trial by fire and proven your father-in-law's faith in you was not misplaced. You are free." It was over. Complete victory. As the court adjourned, Thomas finally lifted his head, his face ravaged by tears. He looked at Felicia, his eyes a bottomless well of self-loathing, knowing no words could ever bridge the chasm he had created. Felicia met his gaze not with triumph, but with a quiet, somber finality. She gave a single nod, an acknowledgement of the tragedy he had authored, then turned and walked out of the courtroom without a backward glance. 2 weeks later, Felicia gave birth to a healthy, beautiful baby boy. She named him Arthur. The day she brought him home, the mansion felt different. Isabella was gone, having retreated to await the results of the DA's investigation. Thomas remained a ghost in the guest wing. Felicia stood in the grand foyer, holding her tiny son. She looked up at the portrait of the first Arthur Braddock, then at the empty, faded space on the wall where Isabella's portrait used to hang. The house was no longer a cage or a battlefield. It was a sanctuary. It was home. Her son Arthur Vale Braddock cooed in his sleep, his tiny hand wrapped securely around her finger. He was not a mistake. He was a legacy. And she was his guardian. The past was a story of pain, but the future was hers to write. From courtroom humiliation to the head of an empire, Felicia Braddock's journey is a breathtaking saga of karmic justice. A husband's cruelty sparked his own downfall, but a father's final act of love provided the ultimate checkmate. She didn't just win her freedom, she inherited a fortune and proved that true power comes from character, not just a name. If you were moved by Felicia's incredible triumph, hit that like button to show your support. Share this story of empowerment with a friend. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another video where justice is finally served.